And share this screen again. So, firstly, just a welcome to this information session. This only came about because when we had um, our last simulation session a couple of weekends ago, there was heaps and heaps of questions, and I kept getting the same questions from different people. So I decided it was easier to distribute all this information in one go to lots of people rather than lots of people in short amounts of time. But before I get started, for those that haven't met me before, obviously my name's Josh, also known as Smurf. Smurf Endurance Sports is my company, and we run a couple of events here in Cairns 50, and then obviously the Backyard Ultra, and then we do coaching both face to face and online with everything from runners to triathletes, sprint distance to ultras, Ultraman and Ironman, and then in the ultra running scene and trail running scene, everything from 50K up to 200 milers. And then my own experience in that range is everything from a 50K road ultra up to a couple of 200 milers. And then, of course, in the backyard ultra. And a couple of years ago now, Dead Cow Gully, I did 36 yards and was the assist to a fellow called Barry Loveday. But I haven't done a lot of backyard ultras recently. It's been more coaching people in that space. And the purpose of tonight is to just give you as much information as I can about the Backyard Ultra, the format, nutrition, fluids, hydration, pacing strategies, so that you can go away, use it, abuse it however you wish, and then hopefully get the most out of yourself for the event itself. Uh, and to be fair, a lot of the stuff that is in this is targeted probably to those that are going 6+ laps or even 10, 20 laps. So some of the information may not be relevant to you, but it's still useful knowing. And even if you're coming out to do somewhere in that 2 to 6 lap range, there'll be still stuff in this presentation that you'll find of use. So as I said, for those that just came in and missed it, I'm just going to talk through all these topics for the next half hour or so. If you have questions along the way, please write them in the chat or write them down, and we'll have time for questions at the end rather than starting and stopping. But to start with, let's talk about the Backyard Ultra itself and some of the key considerations that you need to be aware of or considerations that you need to make when preparing for an event like this, and then also actually participating in an event like this. Because for those that have done, let's call it a normal ultra, a point-to-point ultra, or even an Ironman or a marathon, it's very, very different in terms of the intensity, the duration, and the whole format. So obviously, in terms of the intensity, it's very different to running, say, a marathon or even a 100 mile or 100K point-to-point ultra. The intensity tends to be very, very low, and 6.7 kilometers within an hour is very achievable for most. And in fact, you can walk the 6.7 kilometers in an hour. I've done it myself in a backyard, so it's possible. So the intensity for an event like this is much lower than what you might normally engage with. Therefore, when we look at things like nutrition and your pacing strategies and whatnot, that's a key consideration for us to make. The duration as well. So with this event, you don't actually get to the marathon mark until you're about 6.5 hours in. So for many who might be running anywhere from a 3 to a 5, even a 5 hour marathon, you're out there for much longer on your feet than you normally would, and out there in the elements for much longer than you normally would. So the duration of this event, whether you're going for 6 laps or 24 or more, is much more than what you perhaps are used to. And there's a lot of time on feet. So that's a consideration that we need to make when we're planning for a backyard ultra. Obviously, the format's very different. So you have breaks that you wouldn't normally have every hour, and they're forced breaks, unlike a point-to-point ultra where you get to stop at an aid station for as long as you need to recoup or to sleep or to eat or whatever it might be. And this one, you may only have 3 minutes, you may have up to 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how fast you do a lap. So that's a different consideration that you need to take into account. For this event in particular, the heat is a significant consideration. Now, we got lucky last year. The first 6 hours were pretty brutal, and then it was quite overcast. So those that went 24, 30+ hours probably only managed to do so because the heat wasn't as bad as we expected. However, the previous year when we were up in the tablelands at Old Mate's Farm, it was atrocious. And chances are this time around, the heat will be a significant factor. So that's a key consideration for us when we're planning for this backyard ultra. Um, the access is different to what you would normally have. So your crew, for example, gets to see you every hour on the hour at least. And then you have more access to your crew. You have more access to facilities than you normally would for an ultra. So that's something to consider in your planning. The time of day or night, depending on how long you're going for, what your normal sort of routines are, circadian rhythm is something to consider and something that could go for a long period of time and planning around that. And then finally, obviously, when you're on your feet for such a long time, out in the heat, in the elements, and doing, continuously moving, there's a significant amount of muscle breakdown, body breakdown, and those sort of processes. And if you haven't done something this long before, or you haven't done anything past the marathon distance, then it's a whole different world that you need to be prepared for. So we're going to take all those things into consideration when we look at these different topics that are coming now. And the first and probably the biggest topic that I've had so many questions about recently is nutrition, because if you haven't done anything much more than an ultra or even an Ironman is very different. And then even to be fair, a point-to-point ultra is different to a backyard ultra and what you can take on. And probably one of the number one tips I would give to begin with is that you can and probably should focus on more whole foods, particularly early on. You can front load the whole foods rather than going straight to sports nutrition options and gels and whatnot, because when we talked about the intensity is much lower than what you may normally do. There's lots of walking, and then you've got plenty of time where you're stopping for your breaks at the end of each lap. Then you can consume more whole food options and get away with it. You won't or may not have as much stomach distress and GI distress. So it is definitely an option to take on more whole foods. And that's particularly early on. So as you wear and tear and there's more muscle breakdown, there's more blood pumped away from your stomach to help fuel your muscles as you fatigue. Later on, it gets much harder to consume those whole foods, and that's when you might want to shift to more simple sugar options and sports nutrition options. But early on, you can definitely eat more whole foods. Uh, as I said, sports nutrition, simple sugars like lollies and whatnot still have a role to play, but I would consider leaving those until later on when you're struggling to digest other food options. But in the heat as well, gels, electrolyte drinks with carbohydrate, and simple sugars like lollies can be useful during laps when it's a bit hotter and your stomach's not in a position to be able to digest more whole foods. So they definitely have a role to play, but you're probably not going to be sucking down gels every lap for 24 hours, or I definitely wouldn't suggest it anyway. And the other thing to consider in an event like this compared to, say, an Ironman or a marathon is utilizing a more diverse range of macronutrients. So at the moment, all the talks about how many carbohydrates per hour that you're taking on, particularly in that sort of shorter distance and even into 100K and 100 mile ultras. But because you're at such a lower intensity and a lower heart rate, you can use so you can be taking on foods that have proteins and fat, not just carbohydrate. And I certainly suggest that you do consume some more whole foods that have a wider, more diverse range of macronutrients. So, because you're out there for such a long period of time. Now, protein in particular, you have to be careful because protein takes such a long time to digest. But you can be taking on 5 to 10 grams of protein per hour to try and help minimize the muscle breakdown that's happening in the body without taking on so much that you end up in stomach distress. But you have to be careful with that. Same with the fat. So you can take on more fat than you normally would in a high intensity effort, but still only small amounts compared to the carbohydrate. So the carbohydrate's still your main fuel. Just consider eating foods that have a more diverse range of macronutrients. But yeah, avoid huge amounts of protein, huge amounts of fat, and huge amounts of fiber as well. So if you are someone that's going to be using wraps or bread in some way, shape, or form, keep it to white bread and white wraps. You don't need whole grains. You don't want to be trying to break down things that are difficult to break down in your stomach, because then they'll just sit in your stomach and become an issue. So you want things that will be digested relatively quickly. And the other thing then, because you're not just consuming carbohydrates, you can't really and probably shouldn't really calculate your nutritional intake via just carbohydrate. So if you're taking, say, 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, that's 240 calories. But then if that also has some fat and protein content, you could be ingesting anywhere from 300 to 400 calories without realizing it. So you're better off, if you're going really deep, you're better off calculating what your nutritional intake looks like via calories rather than carbohydrate to make sure that you don't overdo it. Now, what that looks like in terms of calorie intake is really difficult for me to talk about because everyone is different depending on your body size, depending on your gender, depending on the heat and your tolerance to the heat, and how much you've trained your gut to be able to take on different foods and different amounts of calories. But as an average, I would say aim for 200 to 300 calories per hour. Some people will be able to go as low as 150 calories per hour, some as high as 400. And you're running out of time, but this is your sort of last chance to really practice what you can take on and how much you can take on. But something in that 200 to 300 calories per hour on average. There's going to be some laps where you probably eat less and some laps where you eat more. And the longer you go, the more that will vary. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later. But as an average, aim for around about that. But it's very individual. And I highly, highly suggest you practice your nutrition strategy as much as you can before we get to the event itself. Also acknowledging that obviously if you're out there for 20 plus hours, I don't expect you to be doing a 20-hour training run to find out what works for your stomach. But at the very least, try everything that you're planning on using. And then the other consideration is your sodium intake. So it's going to be very hot. You're going to be sweating a lot. So you may need to take on more sodium than usual. But then your sodium intake has many other considerations too, like we said before, your body size, your gender, how much you sweat. Sorry, I just got a few people in the waiting room. I'm just going to allow in. Sorry, guys, those who just joined us, I have recorded this session, so you'll be able to catch up what you've missed when we get there. So yeah, sodium intake. So it could be anywhere from 400 to 1,000 milligrams per hour. Some people might even be above that if you're a heavy sweater. You can, if you're in Cairns, you can get I think Nick at Ignite's still doing sweat testing, so you could go get that done in the near future if he's around at the moment. But the with your sodium intake, you'll know if you're taking too much or if you're not taking enough. If you find that you're taking a lot of salt and sodium and you're starting to feel nauseous, you're probably taking too much or you're not having enough water. So you can balance it out there. And then if you find you're starting to get salty on you or you're starting to get headaches, then you're probably not taking enough, but also probably not taking enough water. So yeah, consider what your sodium intake looks like. As I said before, make sure you try everything that you plan to use on race day as much as you can. So ideally, you're not trying anything new on race day. It's already a bit tricky because more than likely, if you're going to a PB distance, it's all new anyhow. So you want to minimize the foods that you're using that you haven't used before, but have options. You'll find that there's sometimes that you really want sweet food. There's times where you'll be completely over sweet food and gels and whatnot, and you just want something salty or savory. So make sure you have a range of options that are sweet, salty, savory, and then you can pick up whatever you need along the way that will help with that craving. So then in terms of what those options could be, this is a very, very short list of potential options you could use in whether it's a backyard ultra or a point-to-point ultra. And again, it's up to you to find what works for you. But noodles are a staple for many. Fruits and dried fruit or whole fruit, of course, or fruit products. I've found recently that I think it was in Coles or Woolies that I used in my last ultra was like some I like fruit roll-ups, but without all the shit in them. It was just dried fruit essentially. They were pretty good. But of course, if you don't normally eat a lot of fruit and you start shoving down heaps of dried fruit, be careful. You might end up a lot of time in the toilet. So take care with that. But in these kind of conditions, like cold fruits like watermelon and orange and whatnot, especially if you can have it semi-frozen or cold, would be great. Rice products are a fantastic option because they're gluten-free most of the time as well, and that will help minimize GI distress. I don't suggest pastas. They're too heavy for your stomach, but rice products are great. At Coles and Woolies, you can get these great little rice puddings and come in a couple of different flavors that are perfect serving size. You can eat them hot or cold. I use them all the time. I've even used sushi before. Obviously, you have to be careful, make sure it's fresh, but then other rice products are good options too. Wraps, sandwiches, toasties. I do suggest gluten-free, even if you're not normally someone that eats gluten-free, because if you're eating lots of breads and items like that over a long period of time, you'll find that it'll build up in your stomach and it could become very uncomfortable. whereas gluten-free products don't seem to sit so badly. And definitely stick to white options. And then, whatever spreads or things that you use, Vegemite, honey, peanut butter, um, even toasted sandwiches, whether it's ham and cheese and whatnot, or cheese and Vegemite is a good one. Whatever you like in that space. Yeah, try a few different things. Chips, whether it's hot chips or crisps. You like out there at Smithfield, we're not far from McDonald's. Mind you, the oil in their chips probably isn't the best option, but there's heaps of options around there. But even just potato chips are good. Nuts are a possibility for some. Just be aware of the fat content and protein content and nuts. It might be something you do a little bit, but be careful taking on too many nuts. But mashed potatoes are a good one. Biscuits, whether they're sweet or savory, like I've used heaps of different flavors of shapes, Oreos, yeah, all sorts of cakes and things, lollies, whatever you like to eat. Pancakes, waffles are good options. Pizzas, burgers, I've seen them eaten at aid stations and in a backyard ultra. Soup is a fantastic one. Smoothies, but I wouldn't be going a protein smoothie. But smoothies are a good way, particularly in the hot conditions that you'll get if you have some way of making them to get down some calories, and it should be nice and cold. But as I said, that's only a very short list. Have a think about the things that you normally like to eat and what you could use. And also not included in that list is things like gels and chews, which are all good options as well at different points throughout a backyard ultra. So the other half of this whole conversation around nutrition is hydration, and they can't be done without the other. In these kind of conditions where it will be hot, you'll probably find you need to take on much, much more water than normal. Now, on that course last year, we had 3 water stops. There'll be 3 water stops again with ice water, and we were topping up those water stations every lap over the first 10 hours or so because it was so hot, and it would be the same this time. So you need to make sure that you're getting in appropriate hydration. Otherwise, you could end up around the corner at the hospital. So again, this is completely varied depending on you, your body mass, your gender, your sweat rate. 500 mils to 1,000 mils per hour. It could be even more than that, particularly in the heat. Make sure you've tested it yourself to see what you kind of need to take on each hour. And as I said, if you have the opportunity to get a sweat test, then why not? It's a good way to try and nail that down. But you should be using a few sources for hydration. So not just water. Yes, absolutely. Plenty of fluid in terms of water, but then also electrolytes, whatever your electrolyte drink is. Uh, Coconut water is a good option. And then you'll find probably end up drinking soft drinks and maybe juices and things like that as well. We talked about sodium intake and what to consider there. And then the other thing to be really careful of is checking what is in the electrolyte drink that you are drinking if you are using an electrolyte. Because if it is just electrolyte, then obviously you need to be getting all your calories from other options and other nutrition. If there's calories, carbohydrate in your electrolyte, then you need to be aware of that so you're not overdoing the calories from other options. So make sure you check carefully exactly how much you're taking per hour in terms of the fluid, because that will influence how many calories you're taking on if there is carbohydrate in that electrolyte drink. And be aware that if it's hotter, you're going to drink more. And if you've got carbohydrate in that drink, then obviously you're taking on more fuel. Whereas if it's colder, which is not likely to be, but obviously you're going to drink less, and then you're not going to take on as much carbohydrate. So you need to top that up with other food options. So you do need to take notice of how much you're drinking and how many calories are in that if it is a carbohydrate drink as well as electrolyte. So options for hydration: water, obviously, electrolyte with or without carbohydrate. So consider that carefully what you're doing in that space. You may be someone that needs to take some salt tabs. So when you're considering your sodium intake, you need to look at the electrolyte drink that you're drinking. You also need to look at all the food options. So if you're eating noodles, heaps of sodium, you probably don't need to take anything extra. Vegemite, and then obviously some savory products, pretzels or chips or whatever have sodium. So take note of how much sodium you're taking in per hour through other options, and then consider whether you need to top it up with some salt tablets or not. If you haven't used salt tabs before, like they're completely safe. The only thing that will happen if you take too much is you'll start to feel a bit nauseous and you need to drink more water. But I do suggest testing them before you get to the event day. Obviously, sports drinks, no martinis, soft drinks. So anything from lemonade to ginger ale, both of which are really good options if you do feel a bit nauseous at some stage. Coke, of course, is liquid gold in these kind of events, but I do suggest saving that until you really need it. In the heat, there's plenty of research, most recent research in the last 4 to 5 years, talking about slushies and cold drinks and how much they make a difference to your core temperature and your performance in the heat. So if you've got an opportunity in some way, shape, or form to consume some slushies and using ice products of some kind, that's a good option. And then, of course, caffeine. Now, if you're out there for anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, then you don't really need to worry about caffeine intake, except you'll probably have, having some caffeine before the event is, of course, a good option if it's something that you normally do. If you're out there for a long period of time, then caffeine becomes a really important tool to help you go longer. In terms of when to use it and how to use it, I usually suggest not starting caffeine until you start to feel tired. So if you normally drink caffeine in the morning, I definitely still drink a coffee in the morning. Otherwise, you could get some withdrawal symptoms, some headaches and whatnot. But then save the caffeine until you're tired, until you get into that nighttime period when you'd normally be going to sleep and you need a little bit of a pick me up. And then aim for, and it's quite a wide range again, but somewhere between 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass. So if you're 70 kilograms, that might be 280 milligrams of caffeine every sort of 5 to 6 hours, which is, I think, about a double espresso or maybe a bit more than that. But have a close look at that. If you're someone that often drinks a lot of caffeine, then you might need to go more like 5 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass. If you drink less, then you need to stick at the lower end. But again, be careful with caffeine if you don't usually use it, or if you haven't used it in the quantities that you're going to or you're planning to, because it can screw with your gut and you could end up spending a lot of time in the toilet there as well. So, in terms of putting all that together into some sort of nutrition and hydration plan, what I suggest is, particularly when it's really hot, like our event, during a lap, that you 100% take a bottle, a flask, maybe a hydration pack. Like, I don't really recommend a hydration pack because then it helps to keep heat in. It's big. You don't really want to be lugging that around. You're better off with a bottle or a flask. It's easy to carry. And then drip feed the hydration through the lap. You don't want to be trying to consume a liter of fluid in the 10 minutes that you're back at your gazebo waiting for the next lap, because you're going to end up sick. Simple as that. It's not going to work. And you will probably end up dehydrated as well, trying to get all that down. So you're much better off drip feeding the fluid throughout the lap. And as I said, we'll have water stations out there so you can refill while you're out there. Um, then consider taking some nutrition with you each lap, even if it's just a little bit of stuff. So part of the problem, particularly in the heat, and then if you're only in between laps for 5 to 10 minutes, if you're trying to get 200 to 300 calories in that short amount of time, there's a chance that you end up with some GI distress. Whereas if you can drip feed some of that nutrition for the 40 to 50 minutes that you're out there on a lap, then you don't have to take as much in when you're relaxing in between laps. So when you're out there on the lap, though, consider more easy to digest options. So that's probably where you can use things like gels, because they're much easier to get down, or chews, or lollies, fruit products if they're things that you can carry. You probably don't want to be munching on like biscuits and chips and stuff out there. Like, it's uncomfortable. It gets like stuck in your teeth and stuff, and then it's harder to actually eat and swallow. Even like sports bars, sometimes they might be okay early on, but after a while they get really hard to kind of get down. So stick to really easy to eat, consume options out there. And it might be that you go a electrolyte drink that's got some carbohydrate in it. And then in between loops or interloopal, this is where you get most of your calories in, but you want to do that as soon after stopping as possible. So if you walk into your tent, you sit down, you go through it, whatever process it is, but as soon as possible, you want to be getting some food in and then drip feeding it through that time, so that you've got a bit of time to relax and digest before you get out there on your next lap. And then if it is a lap where you happen to eat a lot more than you might normally do, you might walk for the first few minutes after that break, just to give your body some time to settle, try and digest some of that food before you start running. And you're in no rush. You've got an hour to get through a lap, or if you're aiming for 45 to 55 minutes, you got a long time. So you don't need to rush off running straight away. So take your time. And then, of course, that's your time to top up fluids too. But as I said, you don't want to be trying to knock down a liter of fluid and 300 calories of food in between loops. Try and drip feed it as much as you can. And actually, talking about bottles, flasks, and whatnot, part of your mandatory gear, you actually have to have some sort of hydration solution with you out on course, even if it's just a collapsible cup, so you can fill that up at the aid stations. We don't want people drinking from the actual water canisters themselves. Then the other question is, what do I eat and when do I eat it? So as I said earlier, I would consider front loading with more whole foods early on. So when your body's in a more restful state, it's not as hot, you're able to consume a bit more. So that's when I'd aim towards more whole foods. As it gets hotter, as your body starts to degrade, then you probably need to shift to easy to digest foods and simple sugars. So save them for later. It also kind of gives you a bit of a hit. So if you're saving those simple sugars for later, then early on, you don't end up on that sugar roller coaster straight away. It's much more level. Whereas once you start taking caffeine, start taking simple sugars, you put yourself on that roller coaster of the highs and lows. So consider saving that for later. And then if you're going really long and we're talking, 24 plus hours, if that's part of your plan, then consider what your usual routine is. So what I like to try and do is plan at lunchtime to have something that I would normally kind of have for lunch. Afternoon tea, have afternoon tea. At dinner time, have dinner. At dessert, I'll have some dessert. So trying to keep it in some sort of normal fashion as much as you can. Like this is not normal, to be fair, but some sort of normality so that you're keeping yourself in a normal kind of rhythm as much as you can. And then for these conditions, obviously consider more liquid and cold options than what you might normally do because it's just going to be so hot. Um, you might also find that because it's so hot that you need to consume less calories. You're not in a position to be able to consume as much because what happens in the heat, a lot of your blood is pumped to your peripheries and to your skin to help with cooling and evaporation of the sweat and whatnot. So there's less blood in the gut for you to be able to digest foods. So sometimes you need to take on less calories, uh, or you consider taking more calories from liquids rather than whole foods. So moving on from nutrition, and as I said, if you've got questions, please write them down or put them in the chat. We'll get to those at the end. Planning, strategy, and pacing. So this is probably the second question I get the most is how fast should I run my laps? And there's quite a few different schools of thought. We've seen the likes of Phil Gore, who currently still has the Australian record of 102 laps. He runs everything from 50-minute laps to 35-minute laps. 35-minute laps in the nighttime to get some sleep if he's showering or whatnot, and then slower laps if it's hot or during the day and like a big range. Whereas Harvey Lewis, who's the current world record holder, 108 laps, he did most of his laps when he set that record around 55 minutes and was in and out very quickly during in between. The sweet spot, however, seems to be around about 48 to 52 minutes. There's been about a decade of backyard ultras now, and there's enough evidence to say that that seems to be the sweet spot for most. It means that you're not going too hard, that you're burning yourself out, but you're going hard enough that you've got a good 10 minutes at least in between laps. But also be aware that even if your lap slow, let's say you've been doing 48-minute lap, 48-minute lap, 49, 50-minute lap, and then it starts to slow and you get to a 53, a 55-minute lap. That doesn't mean that your day is over. You can keep going. Even at 57, 58, 59 minute laps, people can get out back into that starting corral and go again. I've seen it done numerous times, and as I said, I've seen it done and done it myself where you can walk a lap in the hour and get back out there and go do another one. So don't feel like as those times slow down, it doesn't mean that your day's over. And as I said, Harvey Lewis, he was doing 55-minute laps and did 108 of them. So very possible. But if you're able to, probably not during the heat and during the middle of the day, but if you're able to, consider some faster laps as part of your plan if you need to do more stuff during between loops. So perhaps you're having some toilet trouble, you need to spend some more time in the portaloo, then you might need a faster lap. Or perhaps you're having some sort of a shower or you're changing clothes or having a bigger meal, you might need to be in between laps for longer. So you might need the ability, the capacity to run a faster lap. Many others will just be simply holding on for dear life and going around and getting it done. But if you have that ability to run a bit faster, then it's something to consider. But it might be faster laps in cooler conditions, slower laps when it's hot. And then particularly consider what your walk run strategy is. And I highly suggest you have a walk run strategy of some kind. And then you might find that after a few laps, you get into a rhythm anyway. But excuse me, consider what you're doing with the shade. So there's some points in the shade, some points in the sun. You might run in the sun, try and get those bits done as quick as possible, and walk more in the shade. It sounds counterintuitive, but then you're spending more time in the shade than you are in the sun. Think about the inclines on the course, and if you haven't done the course, you can go out and do it. Just be really aware. Most of it's mountain bike trail, so you have to be aware of your surroundings, and it's a shared zone. But go out and test it. You'll find there's a couple of little inclines. There's no big hills, but there's enough little inclines that are natural walk points that might be part of your walk strategy. And some of the single track mountain bike path is technical enough that you might want to walk some of it as well. So have a think about what your walk run strategy is. I wouldn't just stick to a 4 minute run, 1 minute walk or something like that. There's environmental factors that you can take in to consideration to determine what your walk run strategy is. But in the end, whatever you do, have some sort of a plan. So when you're planning it, and I do consider, even if you're planning on doing 3 to 6 laps, have a plan, write it down. Number one, write down what your plan is loop by loop. And I've got spreadsheets. If you want to have a look at those, I can send them through that have all the loops, what I'm planning on doing in between loops, what nutrition I need, what gear I'm wearing, if I'm changing shoes, all sorts of different things. You may not need to go into that much depth, but definitely write down something in terms of your plan. Know what you're going to be eating or drinking when. Because what's going to happen, you're going to get in there, even if you've got 10 minutes between loops, uh, there's going to be adrenaline pumping. There's lots of noise, lots of people, lots of excitement. Your crew might be excited. And then you forget what you're going to eat, or you forget what you're supposed to be drinking. Or next thing you know, 6 minutes is gone, you're going to be out the door. So have it written down exactly what you want to eat and what you want to drink and when you want to do that. But know that that will change. So at least have a plan, but also be very flexible and know that as the conditions change and as you change throughout the event, what you eat and drink may not be consistent with what your plan was. So write in your plan what you're planning on taking out on laps. And I have also used like an in-out tray. So I come into my tent. The first thing I have is a little tray where I put all the stuff that I need refilled or changed. My crew then refill those bottles and empty things and add things in, whatever. Then when I get up and I leave the tent, all I have is I just pick up what's in that tray and go. So there's no thinking for me. My crew's doing all that thinking for me, and it's all done. Plus, it's written down. They know exactly what I want when I want it. So know exactly what you're taking out on your laps. Know when you're going to change shoes or socks or clothes if you're out there long enough to be doing that. If it's going to be wet, you want to have plenty of spare changes of socks. You want to have a couple of pairs of shoes if you can, and you want to have spare clothes. Even if you're planning something in the 6 to 10 hour range, I suggest having 2 pairs of shoes if you've got 2 pairs at least. So you've got another option just in case something goes wrong or there's some blisters that you didn't expect. If you're planning on using the toilet or maybe you need to have a shower, think about managing your feet, or if you're going so long that you need to consider sleep, then include that in your plan as well. And also have, as well as that step by step, lap by lap plan, consider having an interloopal plan. So if you've got crew in particular, have a plan written out step by step. This is what we do first. This is what we do second. This is what we do third. And strategies to manage what happens when you come in during that interloopal period and then when you leave. That way, it takes all the thought process out and you know exactly what's happening. And your crew knows exactly what they need to do and when they need to do it, which obviously means you need to share that with your crew and have that discussion around, okay, this is what we're doing, this is when we're doing it. I also like to have some rules for my crew. So, um, like one of my number one rule in a backyard ultra, don't quit in the chair. And they know that, and they don't let me quit in the chair. They make sure I get in that starting corral and I actually start the next lap at least. Um, for example, one of the other rules that I usually use is that we leave all the noise outside. So I don't want to know who's struggling, who's doing well, who's doing this, who's doing that. We just focus on ourselves and what we're doing, and then everything else just happens around us. So we control what we can actually control. So share your plan with your crew, have some rules in place, and make sure that that's ready to go. And then if you are someone that's planning on going a long time and you need to consider sleep, my suggestions around sleep is you try to sleep as early as you can, as often as you can. Obviously, not easy, particularly when it's hot, but at the very least, you're getting some shut eye. And then in those night laps, if you're getting to that point, then if you can run some faster laps to try and get 5 to 10 minutes of sleep every now and then that's huge. What you'll find, those that go really, really long are able to get somewhere in that 5 to 10 minute range, basically every lap, most laps during the night, and they end up accruing a couple of hours of sleep throughout the night. So if you're someone that's going long, have a plan for your sleep. And then probably the third biggest question I get is equipment. What stuff do I need? How do I set it up? Now, the number one thing about this is it depends on how long you're planning on going for to how much you need. If you're going to be out there for up to 6 laps and no more, then you probably have a gazebo, but you can share it. I spelled gazebo wrong. I have a gazebo, but share it with someone else. If you're out there for 6 loops, you don't necessarily need to have a whole gazebo to yourself. And you probably got an esky with the food you want and a chair. And that's about all you really need for that sort of 2 to 6 lap range. But then when you start to go really long, there's some other things to consider. So gazebo, yes. Consider with that gazebo whether you have walls or not. With that heat, you probably want a bit of breeze. So some mesh walls are a good option. But then you might also want some privacy. So have a think about what that looks like for you. It's a good idea to have a tarp or mat on the ground, particularly if it starts to get wet. You don't want to be sitting around in boggy fields and it's quite dirty out like there's lots of dirt out there. So if it rains, it will get quite muddy. A chair is a must-have. Highly suggest a recliner chair. They're not super expensive, but if you're going to be going for a long time, you want to be able to put your feet up. And at the very least, you have an esky or something to put your feet up on. Esky, obvious, need to ice. It's going to be very hot. Storage. So think about how you store your clothes, your gear, your food, and in a way that you have easy access. So I use like camping, like a little camping cupboard, a couple of those with everything in Tupperware containers. Everything is labeled, so I know exactly where things are. My crew knows exactly where things are. Everything goes back to where it came from. Because in between laps, we want to save as much time as possible and be as efficient as we can. Medical wise, you need to make sure you've got anything you might need for foot care, whether it's any sort of bandages or things like squirrel's nut butter or whatever it might be, chafe cream, paracetamol. So in that space, I highly, highly, highly suggest not using ibuprofen. There's huge amounts of research out there about the dangers of ibuprofen in these kind of events, particularly when it's hot and you're dehydrated. So I highly recommend not using ibuprofen. Paracetamol is okay though for the most part. Have a basic first aid kit. We will have first aid there and we will have a first aid kit, but have a basic first aid kit there for yourself for little things you need to patch up. You have to have a snake bandage. It's part of your mandatory kit. You have to take every lap with you. And then consider things you might need for heat management, like, towels and ice vests or whatever it might be. In that interlupal period in this event, you want to cool yourself down as much as you can. Then for your clothing and shoes and socks and hats and whatever, obviously you need all those sort of things. Consider the conditions. Uh, so obviously you want sort of cool clothes, things that aren't going to make you hot. There are the two dress up laps, the Smurf lap, lap 3, and then the Halloween lap, lap 5. So consider carefully if you're dressing up what you're going to wear. Last year we had someone dress up in the Halloween lap as I think it was like Jason or Freddy Krueger or someone, and they were just covered head to toe, and they sweat themselves to death basically, and they were out the next lap. So consider very carefully what clothing you wear and have options because as you sweat and it gets hot, you want to change. Then, if you're going for a long time, you probably want to have a pillow. An eye mask is a good option if you're trying to get some sleep. Maybe a blanket. Have some warm options for night, even if it doesn't get super hot. Even at 20 degrees out there, if you're sweating, you will cool down in between laps. And then earphones, your phone, if you're going to do that. If you're using earphones, you can only use a single earbud or bone conduction only because the paths, the trails will still be open. So no full earbuds or anything like that. You'll need your chargers, a watch. The question is, do you pause your watch in between laps or not? Everyone's different. I think you just should let it run full stop from start to end. Otherwise, you'll forget it as well. And then finally, a head torch if you're going into the night. And there's heaps of other possible equipment you could use and need. I've seen all sorts of things from fans, exercise bikes, massage tables, all sorts. But have a think about how long you're going and what you're going to need. And then think about how you're going to set up your gazebo. You can watch heaps of documentaries out there at the moment around backyard ultras. You can see all sorts of different setups, but think about your process and your flow of traffic when you come in. So when you come into the tent, what do you want access to first? What do you need your crew to access first? Then where are you sitting down? And then how are you getting out of there, making sure you don't forget anything. So have a think about how that's all set up. So then let's talk about our backyard ultra in particular and what you're going to encounter. So for those that haven't done it before, or if you're not from Cairns, the course and conditions are quite challenging. It's going to be very hot. It's going to be very humid. We've talked about that so many times. But in particular, the first 1.5 to 2 kilometers is quite open and exposed on like full drive track. And then after that, you get about 2 to 2.5 kilometers of more shaded single track trail. It's still under rainforest though, so it's still quite warm and humid, but at least it's more shaded. Then there's about an 800-meter open exposed section. It's an out and back, out to a water station and back, which a lot of people complained about last year because it got really hot. But you do get to see people, but consider that section. And then the last 1.5 to 2 kilometers mainly shaded, uh, except for the last couple hundred meters up to the finish line. There's some technical mountain bike single track, and for those that haven't usually run trails, we had quite a few road runners last year, trip and fall a couple of times, some of which it ended their day. So some of those technical sections you might want to just take it slower and easier. If you need to let people go past, then to slow yourself down, then let them go past. Slow down, take your time. But there's nothing too hard on that course that you can't manage. You can absolutely walk that 6.7 kilometers in the hour if you're really pushing it. But it's very achievable. And then some other event specific info. So I'm not going to go super detailed here because on the Tuesday of race week, there'll be a full race briefing that will include all the information you need about all the information you need about the event itself, plus the event guide went out last week as well. But key things, check-in is Friday afternoon and Saturday morning. We need you to check in yourself because there's some bits and pieces that we need you to do. You can't have someone else check in for you. And then setup can be Friday afternoon or Saturday morning. I had someone ask, can someone else set up for me on the Friday afternoon? Sure, that's fine. Doesn't worry me at all, as long as you're the one that comes and does your check-in. But make sure you come and see us before you set up so that we can make sure that there's some sort of organization there. It's Queensland election on that Saturday, so make sure you vote early or you do a postal vote. That's up to you to do that. There is an aid station in the event precinct where we'll have first aid. There'll be ice. There'll be a charging station. There'll be a kettle. There'll be some food and drinks. Um, and maybe I'm trying to get hold of a slushy machine, which will be great. So trying to get hold of that, but definitely don't factor that into your plans. It may not happen, and even if it does, it may be very, very popular. Then there's water stations out there, as I said. So 3 water stations out on the course that you have access to every lap, and then also water in the aid station. And then there'll be plenty of portaloos, and we're going to provide some sanitary products in those portaloos and or in the aid station too. So I've just talked for a long time, like 40 minutes non-stop. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there for a moment. If you have any questions, either write it in the chat or give us a yell and ask away. Now's your opportunity. Thanks, Tara. No worries. Good question, Dylan. So Dylan asked, what clothing do you recommend? Long white sleeve shirts. Um, Yeah, if you're going a long sleeve, like I like the idea of a long sleeve, so then you're minimizing the sun exposure. And if you're going to do a long sleeve, then absolutely white. Um, but just be careful of the material. So you want a material that breathes really well. That's not going to make things even hotter. So yeah, long white sleeve shirts are definitely a good option. Last year there was quite a few people getting their kit off and just running around in sports bras or with no shirts. I like it's hot, I get it, but then that sun exposure, if you don't have sunscreen on, can actually lead to more dehydration and more sun exposure issues or heat issues. So I definitely consider wearing something, yeah, sunscreen for sure, and then a decent hat. But yeah, that's a good option, Dylan. Long white sleeve shirts is a good option, and light colored clothing, full stop, is a good option in the heat for sure. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? So if there's something, oh, sorry. Good question, Tara. Yes. So we have new Smurf backyard ultra hats, which I have here somewhere, but I probably won't be able to dig up in 2 minutes to find. Um, but they were available during registration, so some of you might have bought one already. But you'll be able to buy our Smurf Backyard Ultra hats this year at the event. There we have the caps again. Both are by Fractal. They do amazing stuff. We have the caps, and then we have the bucket hats, and then we also have tank tops. Like sleeveless tank tops again this year that are just getting made up now that will be available for purchase. So yes, they will be available, Tara, on race day. Thanks, Matt. Good question. What does the shower option look like? Bring your own shower option. So last year, Adam Fox, who was one of our last ones standings, he had his own shower option, like one of those portable camp showers, which he used in between. Yeah, you could use wipes. That's a good job. But the thing about the shower is it's more than just cleaning. It's also just like that refreshing. It's water, it's cold. Yeah, so no, we won't have a shower for you, Matt, but you can bring your own option, whatever that might be, a bucket and dump it over your head. That'll do. Dylan, what time do people normally come on the Saturday? Yeah, good question. So ideally, the best case scenario is you're able to come and set up on the Friday afternoon, so then you know it's all done. You don't have to rush Saturday morning, and then that way on the Saturday, look, ideally you're probably there about 6. You probably don't want to be much later than that, so you got an hour just to make sure you got everything sorted. And our final race brief is at 10 to 7 before the event, and you may not have much time between the race brief and then the first hour starting. So I would suggest 6 a.m. At the latest. But if you need to set up on the Saturday morning, then you need to give yourself an extra 30 minutes, if not an extra hour, depending on how much you've got to set up. So consider 5:30 on the Saturday if you're setting up your gazebo then. Yeah, Matt, good question. No, we'll have eskies. So he asked ice at aid stations for drinks only or cooling. We'll have ice in eskies that you can use for cooling as well. Yeah, good question. And Kelly, are we able to use the toilets at the skate park? Whoa. Good question. I will find out. I'll talk to the mountain bike club. You're talking about over at the trailhead of the mountain bike park, I think. So I will, yes, I will check with, hello, we'll check with the mountain bike club if we can get access to those. At the moment, we don't, but I'll see what I can do. And then reflective tape. Yeah, so for those night laps, we're going to aim to get some solar lights out there. Some reflective tape will be on our signage. And we're also trying to rustle up some volunteers so that we have a tail bike during the night laps and hopefully volunteers out at that trailhead so that it's safe. We had a few concerns about that last year. So yeah, good question, Kelly. Thank you. All right. If you do have any other questions you haven't had a chance to ask, feel free to send through an email, a message, whatever it might be between now and the event. As I said, there'll be a final race briefing. Sorry, kids, event briefing on the Tuesday before the event. You've got the event guide, but otherwise, happy training. Take it easy. There's not much more work you can do now. It's just getting yourself fresh and ready for race day. And if there's anything in this that you missed that you want to check in on again, as I said, we've recorded it, so we'll put it in. I'll send a link. It'll be in our YouTube. Otherwise, we'll see you on event day. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, they were both crashing and I needed books.